Welcome back to a special edition episode of the Literary Lounge. Today's topic is depression and miscommunication. Let's talk about it. With your hosts,
Ava,
Bailey,
Elizabeth,
and Hayden.
Today's episode is sponsored by Little Free Library, an organization that focuses on building a community of readers through providing free books.
we have a giveaway at the end of this episode for our Patreon subscribers. Stay tuned.
Now let's get into the poem, A Story by Lee Young Lee.
Sad is the man who is asked for a story and can't come up with one. His 5-year-old son waits in his lap. Not the same story, Baba, a new one. The man rubs his chin, scratches his ear. In a room full of books, in a world of stories, he can recall not one. And soon, he thinks, the boy will give up on his father.
already the man lives far ahead. He sees the day the boy will go. Don't go. Hear the alligator story, the angel story once more. You love the spider story. You laugh at the spider story. Let me tell it.
But the boy is packing his shirts. He is looking for his keys. Are you a god, the man screams, that I sit mute before you? Am I a god that I should never disappoint?
But the boy is here. Please, Baba, a story. It is an emotional rather than logical equation, an earthly rather than a heavenly one, which posits that a boy's supplications and a father's love add up to silence.
So, we should probably start with a summary of each of the stanzas. The first two seem like slightly different from the rest of the poem in the way that it's almost a precursor for it, and how it's almost like the speaker is like a narrator watching, because sad is the man, it's like a broad statement rather than a personal emotional one. So I believe that this is a prelude to the rest of the poem. And then moving into the second stanza, when it says his 5-year-old son waits in his lap, not the same story, Baba, a new one. The man rubs his chin, scratches his ear. I think that that's more about how it's starting out the conflict of it, where he can't find one because the rubs his chin and scratches his ear. Those are common gestures associated with somebody who can't quite find something. So somebody like pulls or scratches at their ear, they can't like, it's either like a tell or like a lie, or rubs his chin. It seems like it's somebody who is like searching for something and can't find it. So it's like setting up the idea that he will not be able to think of what his son wants or needs. And then that moves into the next idea almost seamlessly, how in a room full of books in a world full of stories, he can't seem to find one of them that is new for his son, which is what he asks. So, and then it gets into the real big problem, which is the boy will give up on his father, which continues through the rest of the poem as an idea where the father is deathly afraid that their father-son relationship will not be strong going forward because of his inability to fulfill this need and potentially others.
Yeah, and with that, in the fourth stanza, it's showing how the father is limiting himself. Like, as he says, already the man lives far ahead. He's saying, like, he's putting a limit on himself because he cannot reach the needs of what the little boy is wanting of a new story. So he's almost as if I can't do that, I'm not gonna be able to do much more for him. And so now he's just like, please don't go, hear the alligator story, hear the angel story once more. And he's trying to come up with these stories he has already told to try and bring back the boy that he thinks he has lost, even though he hasn't really lost him yet, but he's trying to prevent the loss because he feels that he's unworthy of not being his father, but he's just like
Of like providing for him, maybe?
yeah.
And then in the fourth stanza, the constant disappointments caused by the father culminates in the boy leaving and just completely ignoring his father as he, like in his mind, screams, do I sit mute before you, and am I a God that should never disappoint? So the son's just leaving because the father can't provide. He can't do like anything beyond practically the minimum, it seems.
After like that, he kind of like snaps back into reality by saying, but the boy is here. and his son asks for a story instead of like a new one. So it's kind of just like tying in from the beginning. And he's comparing like emotional, like reasoning behind like logical, and he compares earthly and heavenly. And then the word supplications means an action of asking or begging for something earnestly or humbly. So that plus his love for his son adds up to silence, basically.
With that, Ava, for what the last stanza, I think it's interesting that the final like I think 4 lines are a bit different than the first line of the last stanza, because the boy is here, please Baba, a story is almost like the real closer to the events in it, rather than it is an emotional rather than a logical equation, an earthly rather than heavenly one, and so on and so forth, because those ones almost seem more connected in tone to the very first stanza, where it's like a detached narrator who is almost analyzing the events for what it is and is making a statement, like a thesis of sorts on the events that are happening, by saying, which posits that a boy's supplications and a father's love add up to silence. That is making a claim on the state of this relationship rather than the boy or the father's exact recollections or experiences. Just like the first 2, which is like a precursor to the rest of it, of almost like a narrator introducing the story rather than experiencing the story. Mm-hmm. Which that even brings it up to the idea that who is the narrator?
Yeah.
Well, it seems that the narrator isn't an exact figure in this. It's unknown. There's no personal pronouns regarding who it is, so it's not exactly the father or the son. Well, though one might like have the idea that it could be them in the future recalling this story for like from a more detached point of view. It almost seems like it's like a narrator like from above, almost witnessing this unfold and almost using it as a representation of humanity rather than an exact like instance that happened to the narrator or the speaker of the poem.
Yeah. I wonder, like, with like the title of the story, if the first stanza is kind of just like maybe the narrator had read a story similar to this or is like witnessing something, and so like he's saying sad is the man who's asked for a story, and it's just like, oh, like I'm introducing this, and then he goes on to tell the story, or the narrator, I don't know. So then it's just like the first and last stanza are kind of just the narrator speaking from like analyzing it and looking down onto it, and like the middle stanzas are kind of just like the actual story. Or
that's kind of how I view it too. From the like initial read of this, it is a story as a title is very telling for the content of this. Is a story being told in a poetic format, which is like talking about the structure of it. It's free verse. There's no exact like rhyme scheme in it. It's not closed form. It's going through this and it is telling a story, so it's almost prose-like in its like poetry. It's not what you would think of as the typical A-B rhyme scheme or anything like that. So I think that that's a real contributor to the overall tone of it, even where it's very story-like in its overall like structure, and also the tone seems almost uncertain or fearful or melancholic even because of how it is told and the lens that the narrator takes on it, because if it was exactly the characters, they may have a different feeling on it because of their more personal connection.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the title, I just noticed this, but and this might just be how this poem is formatted, but the title is italicized, and throughout the poem there are different parts that are italicized that are kind of like either thoughts or they're like dialogue. So I'm wondering what significance that has to the poem, and if like the title being italicized is purposeful or whether it's just how it was printed.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
So I found the lines on stanza 5 really interesting. Are you a god? The man screams that I sit mute before you. am I a God that I should never disappoint? Because in all like 3 of those like lines, the father's the one who's disappointing his son. And I feel like maybe it comes from like his childhood, and maybe his father disappointed him, so he feels like he just is really insecure about disappointing his own son because of his own father's doings.
That's a really interesting idea, especially commenting on the idea of the father as a provider, for even in a traditional sense, but even as a parent to a child, where you want to provide for your children. And maybe he believes that he can't that his inability to provide a simple story is always going to disappoint, just like there can be instances where a God disappoints the worshipers, or the worshipers disappoint a God. So it doesn't matter who's in what role, the provider or this figure as the father is unable to, and that's what stems this entire fearfulness throughout the entirety of the poem, is the simple fear that maybe that the inability to provide this very simple thing is going to contribute to an inability to provide anything going forward, which that gives into one of the devices used in this, or some of them are prolepsis and emphasis, which are the italics, which it's a prolepsis, a flash forward into the future, so it's a change in time, which is very interesting in the context of the poem, because they stick out as italicized because it's different than the rest of the text, but also connecting back to the title, which is what Lizzie mentioned. So it's interesting that it goes into the segment of a perceived future that hasn't happened yet, as far as we know. So that gets into the whole message of the poem, of the fear of it, of the fear of a father's like inability to provide, but also an inability to communicate.
And that 5th stanza it has so much to it, like not only with like the italicized like sentences, but there's also, to me it seems like there's a very like major shift in tone. Like it's going from like please stay, like I'm begging you to stay, to kind of accusatory. It's like, are you a god? Like, am I such a horrible like thing, like a horrible being, and I have to do all this good for you? Are you the god? Like, why am I the one that has to provide everything? Why am I the one who's disappointing you? And that's just like such an interesting stanza, and I feel like it's the most important like stanza within this whole poem, because it's just so much to unpack. And I feel like if that stanza wasn't included in that, like this poem would be a very different story. It would be a very different like tone to it as well.
Yeah, it's desperate almost. It's desperate and a bit frustrated.
I find there's a lot of religious imagery in this poem throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th stanzas, because in the 4th one they mention angels, in the 5th the gods and like disappointing, and then in the 6th talking about heavenly and earthly questions. And I just found that interesting, considering it's like a father and a son, and when they mention angels, it's and when they mention the angels, it's just making me think of, like Christianity, Jesus, and God, which is just interesting to me. Many people in the United States struggle with depression. To help relieve those symptoms of hopelessness, irritation, self-deprecating thoughts, poor appetite, and fatigue, take Rexulti. Though it may result in death, spontaneous combustion, stroke, suicidal thoughts, unusual urges, and seizures, when depression sets you back, keep moving forward with Rexulti.
No. Going along with the juxtaposition, I noticed that in stanza 5, again, once he says, "Are you a god?" the man screams that I sit mute. I just like find it interesting that it was mute and screams like compared to each other, like almost like right next to each other. And then another word choice that I saw was stanza 4, when it says, "Already the man lives far ahead," instead of like looks far ahead, it's like he's living in it. Like he's not quite exactly like predicting it, he's almost ensuring that it will happen.
So to tie back to all the points we made, kind of summarize here, the complex tone of both fear and resignation that the father gives it's representative of his inability to communicate with his son the natural barriers of being a human, which leads to narrator's message of that the father being, a member of mankind, they can only ever result in disappointment because he can't provide everything for his son. And the tone of fear and resignation show the desire to satisfy despite humanity's inability to complete these inherent desires, to which the narrator touches on and criticizes. Wow, that was a sad episode. In order to not be put in the father's shoes, we are giving away 2 books. We're going to be giving away Daddy Blues by Mark G. Williams and Mark Williams, and Why Are You So Sad by Beth Andrews. So you never disappoint your kids like the father in this story. We are also giving away 1 whole box of tissues and a whole bottle of Rexulti to cope with our harrowing retelling.